one of the more significant developments. I think it's a significant development in the Ukraine proxy war, even though it's hard to prove or demonstrate that it's directly related, which is the assault, the terrorist attack on the Crocus City Hall Theater in Moscow, in which something like 120 are dead, 180 are wounded. The toll of the injured and dead keeps rising. This is the worst terrorist attack on Russia in 20 years since Chechen jihadists assaulted another theater in Moscow. Or no, it was a school, and carried out a siege of a school in Russia. This attack has been officially blamed by the United States on ISIS-K, the ISIS Khorasan group, which is said to have gestated in the destabilized atmosphere of Afghanistan. And it took the U.S. 24 hours to come to that conclusion. It took the U.S. 1 month to come to the conclusion that Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda organization were responsible for 9/11. I don't even know exactly what ISIS-K is, but I guess we're not able to jump to any conclusions here. A lot of people have already made up their mind on who's responsible. But I want to go into the interrogation of one of those who's said to be responsible and the history of ISIS. But first, before that, Aaron, I mean, what's your take on this? A lot of people in the kind of anti-imperialist Twitter world are either blaming Ukraine or the US and British intelligence for being behind this somehow. What do you think of that?
I mean, people might call me a gatekeeper for this, but the official story, that this is ISIS-K, makes sense to me. They are enemies of Russia. They've carried out attacks on them before. ISIS, to the extent ISIS-K is linked with ISIS, they hate Russia for many reasons, including that Russia defeated them in Syria. So they've been wanting to take revenge for that. So for that reason alone, it made sense to me that this would be ISIS-K. They also were enemies in Afghanistan. And they've hit out at all sorts of targets. They've hit out at Iran. They took responsibility for the attack on U.S. forces in Kabul when U.S. forces were leaving. So the idea that this would have been directed by the U.S. or Ukraine, it just doesn't make sense to me. I don't think they operate that way. Not that they can't, help create groups and inspire groups that carry out these kinds of attacks, but direct involvement just doesn't make sense to me. But again, I'm going off intuition there, not any solid facts. But the idea that ISIS would attack Russia, to me, is just consistent just with Syria alone. Because as John Kerry said, it was Russia that was instrumental in defeating ISIS in Syria because, in Kerry's words, they didn't want an ISIS government, as the U.S. was sitting back and watching ISIS grow inside Syria. So would it be consistent then for ISIS to want to take revenge on Russia around the world? Yeah, to me it is.
Okay. I mean, you're going to get a lot of heat for that, but at the same time, there's no evidence, and I like hard evidence. There's no evidence that they're of foreign intelligence directing this attack. It was an ISIS style attack, like the Bataclan Theater, for example, of just a group of zombified criminal class characters who just come in and start mowing people down randomly. However, the timing follows Vladimir Putin's massive landslide victory in an election, which gives him a major mandate to expand the military operation in Ukraine. It's no longer a special operation. It's a straight up war. They're not even saying that. It follows threats by Victoria Nuland twice, or vows for some nasty surprises on the battlefield for Vladimir Putin. And she's referring specifically, this was during a speech she gave at the CSIS think tank in Washington, referring specifically to asymmetrical threats that were going to be directed by the U.S. against
But Max,
Russia.
let me ask you there. Don't you think if Newland really is going, do you think Newland, if say Newland was complicit in a terror attack like this, she'd be previewing it publicly by like vowing nasty surprises? To me, that's not an argument. Some people have used that as an argument in favor of U.S. being involved in this. To me, that's like, it's the opposite. Why would Victoria Newland preview a terrorist attack if indeed the U.S. was involved in it? If anything, they would want to pretend they have no involvement whatsoever. So it's just not. I think she was talking about, because the U.S. is directing Ukraine's attacks on the battlefield. She was talking about the battlefield, including going after Crimea, which is what she really wants to do.
Yes.
I don't think she's referring to terrorist attacks on concert halls inside Russia.
All right. Well, this is I can forgive the conspiracy theorists for their theories. This is sort of like, I can understand why RT yesterday hosted Alex Jones to present this as a kind of continuation of Operation Gladio. I can understand why people are getting conspiratorial, and just because you're conspiratorial doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Just the timing, the fact that there has been a pattern of Ukrainian terror attacks on Russian targets, Daria Dugina. The Nord Stream terror attack is something that the US is pinning directly on Ukraine, on sort of a secret operation overseen by Valery Zaluzhny, the former chief of staff, without Zelensky's knowledge. There have been deliberate attacks on civilian targets that are increasing from the Ukrainian military, the Belgorod Christmas attack, for example. And so, but the tactics, the strategy might be there. Ukraine's losing on the battlefield. It's getting more asymmetric. It is resorting to terror. Kit Clarenberg did turn up documents where military intelligence officials, British military intelligence officials, were advising Ukraine on establishing a partisan terror army to attack Russian targets. However, the tactics are different. These were not ISIS tactics. Ukraine has not to this point sent gunmen to just randomly mow down people in theaters. So yeah, there's that. Victoria Newland, would she preview a terrorist attack like this? Did she have direct knowledge? I have no idea. She did say she was happy to see the Nord Stream pipeline as a heap of scraps at the bottom of the Black Sea floor. So
because they did that, because the U.S. did that, and she's happy to broadcast that, because that's a covert operation. It's not a, like a massacre of civilians like this attack in the theater. It makes sense to me she would brag about that. It doesn't make sense to me she'd brag about or preview a terrorist attack on a theater, which is very different than attacking Nord Stream.
Okay, let's listen to John Kirby. The U.S. did have a warning, some kind of warning for Americans in Moscow. Let's listen to John.
Noticed all Americans in Moscow to avoid any large gathering, concerts, obviously shopping malls, anything like that, just for their own safety. They should stay put where they are and stay plugged into the State Department for any additional updates and information.
The U.S. have prior knowledge of this attack in Moscow, given that the U.S. Embassy had issued warning beforehand.
I'm not aware of any advanced knowledge that we had of this terrible attack. Put out a note.
So, I mean, that was unusual. What's his name? I'm forgetting his name. He was on Fareed Zakaria yesterday. He's one of these Kremlinologists, and the name isn't coming to me, but he basically said the U.S. really nailed it and showed its intelligence prowess by warning Americans in advance that something was coming in Moscow. But then Kirby denies any advanced knowledge. The Russian government is complaining that the U.S. didn't share their intelligence with them. But this sort of looked like a signals blinking red type scenario. I don't know what to think about that U.S. warning, but it's another reason why people are getting conspiratorial.
I understand. It makes sense to me that the U.S. would cynically exploit this attack and pretend as if they shared intelligence with Russia, which I totally doubt they did. Because, U.S. has said its aim is to weaken Russia. So it makes sense to me that they wouldn't actually be cooperating on stuff like this because relations are so low. But It also makes sense to me, though. I don't think it's a contradiction. Like they probably do pick up stuff, rumblings of stuff like this. They probably do have assets in groups like ISIS-K or ISIS-K directly, and they pick up warnings of this. But it doesn't mean to me that they're actually involved and complicit. It just doesn't make sense to me. But again, a lot of this is, your intuition and your biases. And I understand, as you said, I understand why people are skeptical, and it's important. You can't put anything past these people. They're the most cynical, diabolical people in the world. So I get it. But anyway, for the reasons I laid out, it's not the view I take, but I understand why people think that the U.S. is directly involved in this.
Well, yeah, I mean, there has to be, I think we're going to be learning a lot more in the coming years. The same way that we learned about Operation Gladio. But again, there's no hard evidence. And if anything, I would think it would be the British and not the US. They've just proven themselves to be much more dastardly and ruthless when it comes to Russia than even the US. But let's look at the interrogation of one of those citizen of Tajikistan. These are guys who are like, one of them was a hairdresser. Another one, 3 of them were fathers. These were not like hardcore killers based on their background, who were like contract killers. And this guy, this is in Russian. He's basically saying he can't speak Russian. Anyway, here's a transcript of what he's saying. And he's basically saying, he's saying, I shot them. Who? On whose instructions? People. Why? For the money. For how much money? About $500,000. $500,000 of what? 500,000 rubles. Who did you receive it from? I haven't received it. I received half of it. Where did you get it? Did you transfer it to the card? I threw it away. I threw away the clothes. So he doesn't have the card that the money's on, which makes it hard to track. Who are they? He says, I don't know. They wrote me by telegram without a first name, without a last name, without anything. Did you look for them yourself, or did they find you? They wrote to me. And why did they write you specifically? Did they tell you to kill people? And he's saying that he went to follow a preacher, kind of like sort of like one of these Takfiri, like jihadist preachers on Telegram. And then he was recruited there. He studied at Telegram. I listened to the preacher there. His assistant wrote to me. When did he write to you? About a month ago. I just said hello first. Then he offered me money and I agreed. What did you suggest? I offered to do things for money, like murders. And then they specifically asked me to kill people. Which ones? It doesn't matter. Just go in and kill. Yes. Okay. So assuming that's the case, I mean, this is someone who is very low IQ, very desperate for money, willing to kill, who's like looking for some kind of meaning within some kind of, I don't know what ISIS is, but it's certainly some extremist preacher. And anyone can recruit you through a Telegram group and offer you money to go do that if you're willing to do it. It really reminded me of what would be now an obscure film to most of our viewers and listeners. It's a 1977 film called Telephone. I watched it last night just to kind of like remind me. It's like Hollywood in the 70s at its best. It's got Charles Bronson as a KGB agent, soundtrack by Lalo Schifrin. And it's a Cold War thriller about a extreme, like a hardcore faction within the KGB that wants to stop détente between the US, which has a liberal president, and a Soviet Union that wants to come in from the cold. And what they do is they recruit people in the US by telephone, by entrancing them into carrying out terror attacks inside the US. And the KGB teams up with the CIA to stop this telephone programming terror ring that's attacking targets inside the US. And then, I mean, I called this this live stream Program to Kill, after the book Program to Kill: The Politics of Serial Murder by David McGowan, which is about how many serial killers or mass killers like Whitey Bulger had actually participated in programs like MK Ultra. Whitey Bulger was an MK Ultra victim who had been dosed on LSD over 50 times. Serious brain damage. So what's going on here is someone has programmed these guys to carry out mass murder and entice them with money through Telegram. They're basically rent-a-terrorists. And you had this phenomenon also in Iran during the Masa Amini Women Life Freedom protests, where there would be young men who would go out. One guy went out and stabbed a bunch of Basij volunteers in the streets. And then he apologized before being executed and said he had just been recruited through Telegram, and kind of like didn't know what he was doing, sort of caught up in the moment. So that's, I mean, I think that's the question, is who's programming these characters. And yeah, Aaron, it could be ISIS-K, but it could also just be anyone who wants to rent a terrorist to do some damage to Russia. And ISIS historically has had relationships with Western intelligence. We know that. So I'm not saying put two and two together and it's definitely the case that the MI6 did this, but people are asking questions for a reason. I mean, you look at who the head of ISIS-K, or I mean, there's no head of ISIS-K, but like founder. His license to deal, this is Seth Harp, his license to deal weapons. Okay, this is all just scrubbed from Wikipedia because Seth Harp brought it up. But he was a contractor at Bagram who he worked for Rashid Dostum, who was a CIA proxy in Afghanistan. And then he worked for Amrullah Saleh, which was like, who was like the CIA's man in Afghanistan. Shahab al-Muhajir. I don't know if that's his nickname or real name. It says it right there. This has all been removed from Wikipedia. He worked as a subcontractor of a security company and frequented Bagram airfield maintained by the US. He was a special guest of then first vice presidents Abdul Rashid Dostum and Amrullah Saleh, and had a license to transfer weapons. So, I mean, who is ISIS-K? And of course, we can blame the US for destabilizing Afghanistan to create the void for ISIS-K in the first place.
Same with Iraq and Syria. And that's how I view it. To me, it's the more plausible view for me is it's a case of blowback. The US goes into these places to destabilize them and to undermine their geopolitical enemies, and to end up empowering people like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as was the case in Syria and Iraq. And there ends up being blowback in the same way that, you know, ISIS-K took responsibility for the suicide bombing at the Kabul airport as the U.S. was withdrawing. Was that a case of the U.S. working with ISIS-K and like a false flag attack on itself, or was that a case of just blowback where that's the consequence of the U.S. empowering these people? It ends up hurting everybody, including the U.S. So that's how I view these things. We shouldn't be involved in these foreign places and empowering sectarian death squads, whether it's in Syria, Afghanistan, or Iraq. And when you do that, you're going to have blowback.
Yeah. And I mean, ISIS, there was a point when they were attacking targets in the West, the Bataclan Theater, for example. But for the most part, they've been attacking enemies of the U.S., particularly, or designated and enemies designated by the U.S., particularly Syria. And here's one point where they actually apologized to Israel. ISIS fighters regret attacking Israel and have apologized, former defense minister says. Fighters loyal to the Islamic militant state, this is 2017, have apologized for launching an attack on Israeli forces last year in the occupied Golan Heights region, according to Israel's former defense minister, Moshe Ya'alon. And that was, I mean, ISIS was operating in the Golan Heights throughout the Syria dirty war. And Moshe Ya'alon is notorious for saying many times that he preferred ISIS and Al-Qaeda to be in the Golan than the Syrian Arab Army or the Syrian government, which is actually hostile to Israel, or Hezbollah. So Israel was actually supplying them with, they were providing them with some supplies and logistics to kind of create this buffer zone. So what were they? And then, of course, we have the famous comments by John Kerry during the Syria proxy war. This is a tweet by Aaron Mate. Back when he had Blinken's job, John Kerry explained that the Obama-Biden administration sat back and watched as ISIS advanced to possibly take over Damascus.
The reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. And we know that this was growing. We were watching. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength. And we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. You got Putin to support him. The reason.
So that's, I think he's climate czar now, John Kerry.
Yeah. It's an amazing clip. He's admitting that the U.S. was using ISIS as a tool for regime change in Syria. We were watching as they were going, and we thought we could manage that, and we thought that would compel Assad to negotiate his way out of power and allow us to install someone who we liked in Syria. He admitted it right there. And then Russia came in because they didn't want an ISIS government. Imagine that. Imagine not wanting to see Syria ruled by ISIS. So that's why Russia came in. And that's why I think it makes sense for ISIS to want to take revenge on Russia.
So you can clearly see that ISIS has been useful to the United States, the UK, and Israel. And that's why a lot of people are forming certain conclusions about what happened at Crocus City Hall after Putin's landslide election. The Russian government is pinning it on Ukraine, or at least pivoting in that direction. They're pointing to the fact that this terror squad apparently attempted to escape towards the Bryansk region on the Ukrainian border. The more will come out, but I think it's important to at least address the history of ISIS here and understand why certain perspectives are forming. And of course, then on the Ukrainian side, they're trying to claim that this is a Russian false flag, that Russia would actually allow for the slaughter of so many of their citizens in order to be able to escalate in Ukraine and to win world sympathy for whatever they're going to do next in Ukraine as the Ukrainian military basically folds on the battlefield. And that seems to be absurd.
Of course. Nick Kristof of the New York Times said the same thing, that that was his first reaction. This was a Russian false flag. And it's just so funny. When we document false flags in Syria, when there's so much evidence of sectarian death squads carrying out false flags, whether it's actual chemical attacks, as was the case in Ghouta in 2013, August 2013, or staged chemical attacks, as was the case in Duma in April 2018, we get accused of being conspiracy theorists. But when it's Russia being accused of carrying out a false flag, then everything is totally fine. And but this argument from Russia that these guys were fleeing towards Ukraine, to me, that just doesn't show anything. The fact is they're going in the direction of Ukraine doesn't even mean they're trying to go into Ukraine. If they were trying to go into Ukraine, why wouldn't they try to flee into a country that's at war with the government they just attacked? And also, they could have been trying to go into Belarus, for all I know, because I believe that's also in that region as well. So the fact they're apprehended in the direction of the Ukraine border, just to me, is not very significant.
We'll keep following this. And until then, I advise everyone to watch Telephone. It's free online at Daily Motion, actually. And I'll leave you with the words of Robert Frost. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. Miles to go before I sleep. That's from someone of a generation who actually probably saw that film. That's the code language that was read by a KGB officer to various Americans to compel them to carry out terror attacks.